Thank you, everyone. Okay, they are the 10 most scary words that you'll ever hear in your life. What do you want to do when you grow up? And when I was young, I only ever wanted to do one thing. There was one job above all jobs that I ever wanted to do. I wanted to be the captain of this. This is what I wanted to do. I wanted to fly this. As a 6-year-old growing up in Lithgow, I wanted to be the pilot of the Millennium Falcon. Little did I know that was not true, but it was a fake job. But, you know, over the years, you start to develop and start to ask those questions because everyone else is asking you, what do you want to do when you grow up? And eventually, what I wanted to do came to me when I was in Year 10 at my high school out at North Ryde. My classmates and I had a class assignment for ancient history where we actually had to get up the front and pretend to be journalists. We had to present a lot of information to our fellow peers. And all my peers turned to me, all my students, fellow students, they turned to me and said, "Scott, we want you to be the head journalist for the day." And at the moment I thought, oh, this is fantastic. Everyone thinks that I'm respected, insightful, and intelligent. And I didn't realise until afterwards, no, they picked me because I was stubborn and, you know, hard-headed and also incredibly opinionated. So that was where my love of journalism began. And sure enough, finished the HSC, went off to university. And at university, all young journalists who want to be journalists told, you know, journalism is the foundation of democracy. Truth is so important to our industry. It's so important to our democracy on a daily basis. And so you get wonderful stories about how our jobs as journalists is to go out there and fight for the truth, and you'll end up in a Watergate kind of situation where you go out and bust open the government. And so for 3 years we get this great training, we get all these wonderful stories about what it's like to be a journalist. And so you go into your journalism job nice and shiny and quite excited, and you want to go out there and punch, you know, through corruption. You want to expose all these, you know, wickedness that's out in the world. And what happens? So you go off into journalism, you start to get your first job, and you end up doing stories like this. You do day-to-day kind of colour when you're starting out in journalism. And this one specifically was at a movie, and I think it was off the top of my head, it was Salty. They made a film of it. And as you can see, there's a bit of fake news there. They actually use fake seals in the movie about seals. But that's journalism. When you start off in journalism, you do little colour stuff. You're not out there breaking Watergate. You're not going out there and investigating big things. You're actually doing the day-to-day stuff. And after a while, you realise two things about journalism. First of all, you become bald very quickly. And secondly, you become very cynical about the job you do. Because you're waiting for the day to go out there and actually really go out and investigate corruption, to go and expose all the money that is being wasted on a daily basis. But what you discover is that a lot of journalism is responsive to day-to-day events. And in fact, I think somebody said 99% of journalism is day-to-day journalism. Only 1% of it is investigative. And that really isn't a lot. And there's only by a few people now. So we come into journalism quite excited about it, but after a while we become cynical about it. And for me, my cynicism became at the height in a very public way for when we discovered fake news became very personal for me. And I don't know how many of you remember this. 1999, 2000. South Sydney got kicked out of the competition, the NRL. And as you can see from that, that's a lot of people. That picture was taken from Town Hall. There was a specific march, if you recall, about South Sydney being kicked out. Now, the interesting thing is that the Daily Telegraph, which has always made its money off rugby league, do you think that would have been a pretty important story? 40 to 80,000 people marched down George Street that day. What page of the paper did the Telegraph report the story? Page 1, back page, page 3, which is the second most important page of the paper, or 4, 5, which is known as the spread pages. They reported it on page 44. 40 to 80,000 people marched down the streets of Sydney, blocked traffic, as you can see. On either side, traffic wouldn't have been to go through. Why? Because News Limited had a huge stake in rugby league and they wanted to kill off the Rabbitohs. Newspapers and their owners do have agendas. And we don't want to admit that, but it's quite obvious, and that was one of the biggest examples that was seen in our lifetime. So we saw how bad reporting can actually affect society when people and their vested interests come into play. Well, we're here tonight to talk about fake news because it's in the press quite a lot now. It's spoken about, talked about, it's thrown around. And the term really started, we think, around 2014. It came into public circulation when a BuzzFeed news editor started using it. It was probably around a little bit, but he was one of the first to actually come forward and use it. And then a certain US president came and weaponised it. He started using it against the media. And the original idea for fake news was, the concept was completely fake information that was created and spread for profit. Or in other words, just propaganda. But now fake news has actually been weaponised by people like Trump, where if you disagree with some news information, it's fake news. It can be true, but if I disagree with it because it hurts my feelings, then it's fake news. And so it's now a much more universal kind of term that's used to tear down what is real. Now, as journalists, that's a struggle for us because sometimes real news actually does come out. In fact, every day real news comes out, but people actually are always fighting against it and they disagree with it. And so there's this struggle about how can you convince the public what is real and what is fake, especially when a lot of us, as we'll talk about in a second, is when we've got a lot of competing online stories, and as we've just seen a couple of examples there. It's interesting what fake news can do. A couple of years ago, June 2017, the founder of a cryptocurrency business, he was reported dead online. No one checked it. It just went out into the Twitter sphere, went out into the online community, and you would think, okay, a report that this man's dead won't have much of an impact. A few people will be hurt, you know, his relatives are sad. But the reality is, you know what it cost his company? $4 billion. He was reported to be dead. It cost his company $4 billion. The problem was he actually was alive. He was still alive. But the fake news was out there and it was actually destroying the stock value of the cryptocurrency. So we've got the fake news actually does have a huge impact out there in society. But fake news isn't something that's new. In fact, there's always been fake news. We can go back to Adam and Eve and Satan, you know, Satan giving 2-for-1 apples, you know, they're kind of pushing that kind of information out there. The Egyptians and other ancient Near Eastern cultures, you know, they would record their victories, but they would never ever talk about their defeats. And that's why we have gaps in kind of history, because, you know, the victors would write the history. One of the more famous ones specifically for journalism, and I'll talk about American journalism a bit, is this one. Has anyone seen this headline before? This is one of the most famous big mistakes of journalism in the Western world in the last 100-odd years. Dewey defeats Truman. Great front page. Only problem was Truman ended up president, not Dewey. What happened is the Chicago Daily Tribune, now known as the Chicago Tribune, had decided to print their story before the result was made known. There had been a bit of a union problem with the printing presses, but at that day the reporters just decided, okay, look, it's all Dewey and the Republicans, they're our guy. We're going to go out there. We support them. All the polls show that Dewey's going to win by a landslide. And guess what? That night all the polls came in and all the people said, no, Truman's our man. And so all night the reporter was still filing this copy, and it went through 150,000 copies, I think, this headline, until the paper was pulled and they realised, we better put the front page. Preconceived ideas of what news is. So fake news has been around for much longer there. So why is fake news taken everyone's imagination? Why has it grabbed hold of everyone? Apart from the history of people not trusting the media, it's specifically really becoming an issue over the last couple of years. And I have three theories, and you probably have your own. Mine is, after 23 years of working in newspapers down in Adelaide and then Sydney, for the Adelaide Advertiser and the Australian, I actually think that newspapers are starting to reap what they've sown. For the last couple of years, newspapers have been divisive, more divisive than they have been before. They've been targeting audiences and their anger. We've moved away from actually reporting facts, and now we've gone towards opinion. We're trying to actually tap into tribalism. And that's why I think with divisiveness in newspapers, you'll see, lots of conversations about the left versus the right. We'll see conservatives versus liberals. We'll see gay rights lobbyists versus bigots. We'll see northern suburbs versus western suburbs. We've got private versus public. The media is constantly telling this story that it's us versus them. And you as a consumer have to sit there and you have to make a decision about which side you're on. And that's pretty horrible, isn't it? Because let's be intellectually honest. I don't think anyone's fully left and I don't think anyone's fully right. We like this, we like that. We merge our ideas. Our own experiences tell us what's right and what's wrong. And the media is constantly pushing these kind of agendas now. And there's been some research that's looked at online radio and TV and newspapers over the last 30 years. And it's saying there's been this big shift from news used to be all about facts and just reporting it, whereas now in the 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, it's all about, well, let's just have a talk about it. Let's have opinion about it, which Dave is going to talk about shortly. We've actually got a lot of people who are just giving their opinion actually rather than debating it. And if you've ever seen TV news through the day, it's quite a horrendous kind of thing because you'll have an idea. It's like, are private schools getting too much funding? And you'll have three journalists up on screen debating whether this is right or wrong. When I was going through university, the idea was you never interview journalists. Why are journalists far more important on this kind of thing? Why don't you go and interview the actual people that are there? So we've just got all these talking heads that are just talking and giving us opinions all the time. We've all got our own opinions. We just want facts. And that's where, unfortunately, the media is drifting now. It's all about opinion. And it's kind of scary about where that's coming from. Why is this out there? It's because we're always trying to attract a greater audience. Back in the 90s, when I was down in Adelaide, the big push was always to get more women in the papers. So why? Because it would attract more female readers. And we're doing that again now. We're actually pushing for more women in the paper because women will read the papers. Papers have always been traditionally seen as a more male kind of consumer product. And so we need to get more women in. And it's kind of like, well, just write the truth and people will read it. They'll be interested in it. Divisiveness, an example at the moment, is the left versus the right argument. The New York Times in the last couple of weeks has been caught out in a big way. There was the mass shootings, the two mass shootings on the same weekend. And the example was the New York Times on its front page wrote a headline, "Trump urges unity versus racism." And that was its first edition headline. Apparently the staff rebelled and got quite antsy and got angry about it, and a lot of the Liberal supporters of the paper rang up and abused the paper. So of course they changed their subsequent headlines headlines in the additions to assailing hate but not guns. Incredible bias there. They wanted an agenda. Rather than just saying the truth, just the facts, Trump urges unity versus racism, they had to turn it into a political whipping board. And I don't care what the views of Trump is. At the end of the day, you've got to have truth. Truth is the thing. Don't push your agenda. So divisiveness is an important thing. And I think one of the reasons why divisiveness is out there is because our journalists, a lot of us, are coming from a small group of people. Most journalists that look around my newsroom at the moment are Anglo-Saxon. They're male. They're in the ages 40 to 50 to 60. The journalists are a little bit younger. The day-to-day reporters are younger. Where most people come and live in the inner west, or the North Shore, or the eastern suburbs. A lot have come from the city and lived in the city and only lived in the city. And a lot are atheist. In fact, I reckon 99% of journalists that I've worked with are atheist. So it's a very small group of people, a small dynamic, who are actually trying to represent a larger audience. The second thing I reckon fake news and why it's taken off is because people in general are more disengaged than ever before. It's interesting to see what's happening in the US, what people are reading and where they're getting their news from. 49% of people say they get it from TV. 33% say they get it from the web. 26% say they get it from the radio. 20% say they get it from social media. And 16% get it from newspapers. That's not encouraging. And the reason why, it's an interesting fact for you. A couple of years ago, or a couple of decades ago, somebody sat down and actually counted how many words are in a TV news report, the whole 60 minutes of a TV news report, or 30 minutes of a TV news report. And they realised, then they sat down and counted how many words are in a newspaper. And they compared the two. And they realised that in a TV bulletin, all those words in that TV bulletin wouldn't cover the front page of a broadsheet newspaper. So 50% of our population is getting most of its news from TV. And for me, I'm a newspaper man, and I love newspapers, and it's in my blood. I love it because every day, that's where newspapers set the agenda. Newspapers set their agenda, and you can pick up a newspaper and compare it to what's on the radio in the morning, or you can have a look at what's TV at the night. Radios pick up what newspapers have done, and TV is usually what's the crime of the day. What's the police chase? What's said at Parliament? There's no in-depth kind of analysis. All that in-depth analysis is coming from newspapers. And 80% of what you see on news sites that aren't proper old media, 80% of that usually comes from newspapers, of the news. It's quite amazing to think about it that way. So the problem is, I think a lot of our people aren't engaged with news because journalists and newspapers and TV and radio, depending on what programs they are, what newspapers they are breaking news, important news on a daily basis. There's really good journalists out there who are really doing stuff. A lot of wire reporters who are doing good stuff out there as well. But people just don't seem to want to engage with the news. There's lots of Aboriginal news that's coming through the papers. There's lots of politics news that's coming through the papers, a lot of questions about money and corruption and stuff like that. And it's kind of scary that people don't seem to want to actually engage with it or do anything like that. And the theory is that back in 2001, September 11th happened. And that was a pretty scary event for everyone who was there. And everyone around the world. And people suddenly didn't want to engage with the media as much anymore. And there was a term called cocooning. People went out and bought huge amounts of home electronics so they could actually build their home theatres and cocoon themselves in their home theatres so they didn't have to be out in the scary world and stuff like that. And so people disengaged from the media. They didn't want to watch the news anymore. Which is an interesting kind of thing because your citizens need to actually be engaged with the news and find out actually what's happening so they can be great proponents of democracy. Which leads us to the third reason why I think we're struggling and why fake news is really accepted by people is we've become digitised. It's scary where the media is going. Most people are now consuming their news online. Newspapers are dying. The reason why is because digital is basically free. And so people are going online, you look on your train, on your bus, everyone's looking on their tablets or on their phones for news now. And so we don't know who are the gatekeepers. Who are these people giving us this news? Is it somebody overseas? Is it a local journalist? Is it somebody who's getting paid? Or is it somebody just pushing their own propaganda? And if 80% of news is coming from, stolen from other news outlets, then how are they twisting that? Because you can add your own spin and put your own opinion and stuff like that. And so the digital world has changed newspapers a lot. And unfortunately, we're looking at most newspapers will probably be online fully within the next 2 to 5 years. And you're thinking, well, how does that affect me? Well, the wonderful thing about newspapers is you open up and some editor has actually said, here are 100 to 300 stories that are really important that you need to know on a daily basis. When you get online, you kind of just search for what you want to know. And so we're going to increasingly see less and less kind of education. And there's been plenty of studies about what's happened when newspapers get digitalised and online takes over things. And the first thing is serious journalism dies. So 1 in 5 US newspapers, or a bit more than 2,000 of them, have closed since 2004. Jobs are being shed in Australia and fears for the future. There's less engagement. The studies are showing that with fewer newspapers, we've got less informed voters, lower voter turnouts, less engaged with local politicians. Public spending goes up. There's no accountability, so council wages and spending increases, which is quite scary. So if there's no local journalists actually keeping local governments accountable, well, what are the politicians going to do? They're going to vote for themselves to get greater wages. And then there's also threat of evasion of privacy at the moment. Facebook, Google at the moment, as we know, we're hearing a lot of stories about how they just don't care. They don't play by the old media's rules. The old media could get sued if you stepped on the wrong toes, if you defamed somebody, but Google and Facebook, they don't play by those rules. They've got special rules for them. So your data, your information, who knows what's going to end up with it? And I don't mean to sound alarmist, but there is the alarm bells going off at the moment. We don't know who are going to be the source of our information for the next couple of years. And that's quite an interesting kind of thing to wrestle with. So where do we find truth? It's a pretty big question as we go forward as a society, as we sit there and we actually want to know what's going on with democracy. Where do we find it? And I struggle with it myself. And it's interesting for me because I'm unusual for most journalists. After 23 years as a journalist, a reporter, and a sub-editor, somebody who's basically like the English teacher of a newspaper, goes around and corrects people's spelling and grammar and stuff like that, you naughty journalist. The correct question is, for me, I wonder where we're going next. How do people see the world? What is truth? And for me, it comes down to this. As a journalist, I'm unusual because I'm a Christian. And I look at, and there's only, I think I've ever only met 10 Christians in 23 years who work in the media. That's not a lot of people. And I think this is the big question for the media. Because the media doesn't treat God seriously. Who is God? And I think it's a question that they're all going to have to deal with, because you think about truth, truth actually drives our morality. If we know what truth is, then we respond to it. And I think at the moment it's interesting to have a look around my colleagues in the newspaper industry, because they are struggling with this idea of what actually is truth, what is going to be the future. Because if there is no God, then God for most people in society becomes the government. And we're starting to see that at the moment. People are looking towards the government to make their morality, to legislate. I don't want to be offended, I don't want to be hurt, so I need the government to make laws for me and us to protect me. And that's true to a certain degree. But there is, the parts of democracy is always going to be individual freedom is very important, but there's also a responsibility to society as well. But at the moment, it seems to be all individual responsibility, sorry, individualism. So if God is going to either have to be people, is going to have to be the government, or God is real. And if God is real, then that will shape how morality is and society is, and how the media treat everything. But at the moment, the problem is the media don't accept the existence of God. Like I said, 99% are atheists and agnostics. And so that actually presents their worldview through the media. And they just assume that everyone believes them. And they're wrong. Because you look around the world, and most people are religious to a certain degree. And atheism is one answer for some people, but other studies are showing that just because you walk away from Christianity doesn't mean you're an atheist. In fact, it's more likely that you're going to actually believe in something else, New Age kind of spirituality. And we're going to have these kind of discussions because at the moment, religion is kind of ignored by the media. But religion as such has been underpinning Western society for so long. And now we're just pulling it away. It's like a stack of Jenga blocks, You take away those Christian blocks, one by one, what's going to happen? And that's the question. So I think that's the question that the media doesn't want to grapple with, but society has to. Who is God? As a Christian, that drives me. That's my motivation. That's my truth. I can see everything from being a Christian. I can have those answers of why do I see so much, terrible stuff happening on the world all the time? Because I have an answer in the Bible. I have Jesus, telling me, sin exists. The media doesn't have those answers. In fact, the only answer that the media is going to give, the only thing that I see when I look around is cynicism. The only answer they have is cynicism. And that's kind of a thing that we don't want to balance our society on. Thank you.